So Sarah, we're in February, which you know means two important events. One is Valentine's Day, which is not that important an event in my life, but it gives us an excuse to talk about love. And the second is Black History Month. So we're going to dive into the collision of these two events, if you will. And I thought it might be a good place to start with love and the role it plays in our name. URL Media, as listeners might know, stands for uplift, respect, and love. And Sarah, I don't know if you remember when we set up URL and the conversations we had about the name. I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, but do you remember the role of love and thinking about what that might mean for us?
I don't remember specifically the conversations that we had, but I know that both of us, as practitioners and as media entrepreneurs who are steeped in our communities, recognize that a huge component of our work that drives us and that keeps us going is really out of a fundamental, like deep-seated love for our people. And I think if that's not what I said then, I think it probably was, because it's very much where my head has always been.
That is the right answer. You said we, we um, we're basically expressing in our name our love for our people. And then I said to you, the juxtaposition of love in media is so revolutionary because who thinks about journalism with love, right? One way or the other, meaning it's not like the news really loves us. And certainly, back when we launched in 2020 into 2021, and even this moment we're in, there isn't a whole lot of love from the American people for their media and journalistic institutions. And so the conversation we'd had as we were kind of dissecting each of um, the terms of our acronym, right? Uplift, respect, and love. Um, I remember us being like, "Oh, love in a news company is actually pretty revolutionary." So,
Yeah.
I guess a few years later, my other question for you would be: do you feel like we've lived up to that ambition?
Mm, that's a great question. And I would say yes. I mean, I think that you can't do this kind of work without being driven by something beyond money or recognition or those things that um are outwardly affirming. It really, because it's very hard. It's hard work. Um it's work that I think at its core we're trying to make sure it's transformative work and not just work for work's sake. And I think that, not to be cliched, but love is kind of this um, huge. It's much more than an emotion. And people say love is a verb, not a noun. Like it's an action. And I think that the work that we're doing is trying to put um, love in action amongst many other things. But at the core, I think that there's that's a driver, a huge
Yeah,
driver.
yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think,
Yeah.
yeah, well, I was going to say that the other piece is that we use this framework for everything. So I think there is something about leading with love that has really transformed me over the last few years because choosing love is to what you just said is an action, right? I mean, as you know, Sarah, all too well, I get really frustrated or pissed off. And the decision to actually not just think the best of people, but to um, make the way you treat them centering love, I think is a conscious decision. And again, like revolutionary for a media company, revolutionary for a business. And I'll pivot us to kind of away from the staff, but to our partners and also to the people who we do business with. This idea of um, you know, we are here in support of you and also with it's like a positive framework versus, I think, a lot of maybe ideas or works born out of the racial justice movement of 2020 understandably have a lot of trauma built into them. I mean, this is like our history, of course, is a traumatic history, but also choosing to center love feels um, maybe a counter to some of that, or even a balm, if you will. So that's another area that I think about a
Yeah.
lot with us.
And I think that, because this work, and we're both running two companies, two media companies, um, it can be kind of grinding and grueling, and sometimes it doesn't feel very loving, I don't think, to ourselves or the people around. I mean, it can also feel the opposite of that. And I do think that it's important to remind ourselves that that is, the ground from which we grew for URL. And I know for the work I do with WURD, the Black Talk radio station I run in Philly, I know that our team is really like, we have our battles, we have our, frustrations and all of that, but at the core, we are driven, and I know this is the same for URL. We're driven by a love of our people and
Mhm.
our community, and there aren't a lot of media organizations that exist where you can actually come and be your authentic self as a Black person or a person of color, and get to do purposeful, meaningful work that uplifts, respects, and loves people who have historically been stereotyped, caricatured, undervalued by mainstream media and by, mainstream culture
Yeah.
in general. So I think it's a very profound opportunity, and I think that's a lot of what fuels um, the work. And with so we decided, because of Valentine's Day and Black History Month, to like kind of dissect our commitment to this notion, this idea, this verb, love. Um, but I want to kind of see if we can like drill down a little bit into, because I think that the other thing that we've done, like with our partners, with URL, with our name, with our commitment, and all of those things, is we also support Black and brown businesses and vendors, and we reinforce that kind of love in an economic empowerment way. And so one of the first things that we did early on was, for like our holiday gifts, we gave out gift baskets that featured products and things from diverse communities, Black owned businesses, Asian spices, like South Asian spices. And we featured a book called The Love Songs of W.E.B. DuBois by Honorée Fanonne Jeffers. And one of the things I know we want to talk about today, in recognition of Black History Month and Valentine's Day, is kind of some of these masterful books that have really impacted us, whether they're specifically about love or we just love them.
Yeah.
And I thought we could maybe dive in a little bit about the love songs of W.E.B. Du Bois, because that was, this 800-page book. We were very deliberate in including that in these gift bags, or these gift
Yeah.
baskets that we sent out to um, the world early on in
We
our
operate, Sarah,
evolution.
from abundance, and that postage on that 800-page book was very abundant.
It was
So,
pretty abundant.
yeah,
It was.
yeah. I loved that book. You had read it, I think, before I did, and suggested it for, and we were we curated that first year basket. I hope it's okay to kind of reflect on like the conditions under. We launched URL. We didn't really know how things would go, and we'd had a very good year. Right, we'd grown. We were profitable, and it felt like abundance in so many ways. And in some cases, it surprised me. And I think it's really telling that our instinct was to give back. And so that book, when you suggested it, I thought, oh, this is in some ways like an emblem rather of arts and culture. It's intellectual. It's 800 pages. I haven't read it. I'm going to trust Sara that this is good. And I love, I think you know this, I love W.E.B. Du Bois. I've sort of spent family vacations like showing my children the foundation of his boyhood home in Western Massachusetts. Like I love the framework for the book, but I had no idea what we were getting into.
Mhm.
Do you want to tell me why you picked it? I actually have never asked you that.
Yeah, I mean, at the time, so I belong to a book club. It's on hiatus now, but I've belonged to a book club for, you know, over 10 years, with a group of Black women who very intergenerational, living many different places. And, that was the book that was selected. And I forget who selected it, but there is nothing more exciting and satisfying to me than to find a book that I just can't put down,
Mm,
and a book that reads almost like a film or a series, a TV series. I mean, I have been a voracious reader since I was a little teeny weeny girl. I mean, I read everything, Harriet the Spy, Laura Ingalls Wilder, the Nancy Drew mystery. I mean, like all of it. And just like, I'm a huge, voracious reader. My dad was I grew up in a house that read a lot. And this book, you could just dive in. And what I loved about it was it toggled between like modern day, and like it went back to the 1700s,
yeah,
and it really looked at the intersection of Native American, African, white societies and cultures and relationships, like real, like she just was so determined and deliberate to talk about the nuances and the complexities and the the real deep emotion that created
yeah,
these relationships. And I just thought the fact that she could so masterfully go from the 1700s to the 1980s to the
yeah.
1800s, and tell this very rich story of this Black family in the South that had been through so much that all of us could, anyone who's reading it, there's so many entry points you can find a connecting point, and I
Yeah.
just loved it.
I eventually felt the same way. I read it. So we gave that out, I think, in 2021. I ended up reading it the following year in 2022. And it took me a while, but then I had a similar reaction where I both couldn't put it down, but I didn't want it to end because I found that toggling very immersive. And the love aspect of this to me was also a woman learning to love herself in all its complexities. And I think a lot of the literature, certainly Black literature, I similarly grew up in a house with, literally thousands of books. My father was a voracious reader. I've been a voracious reader my whole life. And there was, and you know this about my dad, Sara, but there was a lot of Black literature in our house. Um, but he intentionally chose like James Baldwin, Malcolm X, um, Richard Wright, like a lot of literature where figuring out what you stood for was the whole point, right? That there's a lot of reaction to the society around you. I mean, Malcolm X comes to mind, of course, in this, but the assertion of yourself and also just love for yourself. Um, was my takeaway from a lot of this literature, and in more profound ways than some of the other books he had around. Like he had a lot of beatnik poetry, and when we cleaned out his house, there was like 7 copies of Mice and Men. Like but I think the Black literature really shaped me. And in the Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois, it was one of the first like at that level of a Black female protagonist, where of course, I've been impacted by Americana and Toni Morrison, but more of the literature I've been raised in was like a Black masculine gaze. And so I
Hmm.
thought this book just had I mean, even like the physicality of the woman that she's writing about, and like sometimes, she's kind of on the heavy side, and then she's like exercising, and there was just so much I identified with, in terms of her finding herself through this process, and really, um, this feeling of love for her family that just went back generations, which I also
Yeah.
really identified with. I think the people who read it from the folks we gave it out to had like a similar reaction, like, oh man, they gave me an 800-page book. But I like that we've heard from people who react to it too.
And I think the other thing that I love about this book, because the title, the Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois. So, if you haven't read it, you're like, oh, this is maybe a love story about W.E.B. Du Bois, who was this amazing African American scholar who, I mean, he particularly resonates with me because of his brilliance, but he also did the Philadelphia Negro that was published in 1899, and it's like one of the first sociological studies of Black people. And it was published by University of Pennsylvania Press. Well, they treated him like shit, but at the time, but he was this brilliant scholar, activist, who coined so many profound um, concepts like double consciousness,
Mhm.
and this sense that Black people are constantly having to wrestle with kind of this two-ness of being Black and American, and what that means, to your psyche, to your spirit, to your yourself. And so the Love Songs of W.B. Du Bois, Jeffers, she talks about the fact that W.B. Du Bois had such a profound love for Southern culture and Southern life. And that was one of the reasons why she infuses and weaves him throughout the book. And so there are these interludes throughout the book where you have these quotes, these very
Yeah.
deep quotes from W.E.B. Du Bois, but he's almost like the muse. He's like this shadow figure throughout the book. And you hear about him in the context of one of the characters, Uncle Root, who is the great uncle of the main character, who's like this beautiful, learned Black man, this very dignified Black man from the South who had, he knew Zora Neale Hurston. He bumped up against Jesse Fawcett. He bumped up against Du Bois. I mean, he had all these interactions that he weaves into his storytelling with the main character, Ailey.
Yeah.
So I love the way she sneaks him in, but he's very present.
Yeah. I mean, it's a meta narrative in some ways because, of course, Du Bois rests so much on scholarship, and this book was so exhaustively researched. You just feel it in every page, like the effort. I mean, it reads, it reads pretty breezy, as you know. On the other hand, you know what went in to make it feel that way. So I definitely agree that her using him as a presence, but then resting on her own research, to get at some of that family history, and then the history of Black institutions like the university, and the role that played,
Yeah,
in
and sororities, and
sororities, and
yeah, I
having
mean,
to put
it's
people through that. Yeah, yeah, it was awesome.
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, is there a scene that kind of sticks out to you, Mitra, like from the book?
I mean, I think, the sister. So, like for me, the
Mm.
love that the kind of flawed nature of family relations and our love for each other. So I'll stick with the love theme. In the book, there's a sister who's, what'd you say, Sarah, like an addict, right?
Yeah, she's
Yeah,
she's
yeah,
addicted to crack. She got
yeah,
caught up in the 80s crack
yeah,
epidemic.
yeah. And the father basically sets her up, and it's a big secret. And so the pain that the family, contends with, having an addict in their family and sort of someone who's there and gone and back again, and the father sets her up. And so the love that it takes to basically support your child, but then live a lie is what I just think about,
Mm,
because that's a different kind of love, right? It is unconditional, which I think is what many of us feel for our families, even when they're so flawed. And so that piece just really spoke to me, because who doesn't have love for family when the family members might be, a little
yeah.
bit broken or somewhat flawed? That's one lesson that stuck with me.
Yeah. And I really loved the relationship between Ailey, who's like the baby, and Lydia, who is the oldest sister, who ends up getting addicted to drugs. And they have and there's like a pretty big age gap. And Ailey just is like enamored. She just loves her sister, who's just beautiful and kind and adventurous. And then, she kind of disappears. And Ailey doesn't understand, like, what happened to my sister. And it is really, it's written so beautifully, and it's so heartbreaking, because you then find out that Lydia was the victim of sexual abuse, and part of, why she was succumbed to this addiction was rooted in kind of her shame and her pain related to that sexual abuse. So, I mean, Jeffers, she gets it all in. She really um, weaves a very powerful story. And speaking of W.E.B. Du Bois, a little fun fact is W.E.B. Du Bois was one of the founders of the NAACP, and today is the founding anniversary, February 12th, 1909. And that's Ida B. Wells, or Ida Wells Barnett, was one of the founders. There, and so this is an auspicious occasion that we're talking about Du Bois, we're talking about this book, and it happens to be the birthday of the NAACP.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's beautiful.
Fun
Um,
fact.
yeah, especially because, at least for me, in hindsight, you look at Du Bois's work like stacked up next to each other, and you're just like, my goodness, and I always, and I've said this before, it deserves way more attention, reverence, care, than I think we give it. So I do think in Black History Month he kind of gets his due, but I feel like as
Mm,
far as like institutions in the US and really commemorating that vision that the NAACP represented, I just wish we had more symbols that we could see, and honor. Um,
yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
But I think there are also some other amazing works that we've been talking about. I know that we at Word are compiling kind of a book list for Black History Month. I know that URL put out, I think, a podcast list, or like audio list of great listens. But what are some of your, like, if you were going to recommend your top three books that you would say are must reads, whether it's for Black
Hmm.
History Month or just to understand Black history?
Gosh, three is really hard. I mean, I kind of go back to what I was raised with, even as I feel like I've spent my life trying to modernize that list. So I mentioned James Baldwin, Go Tell It on the Mountain. I'm committed to rereading that this year. The autobiography of Malcolm X, which I've read a few times, but the counterpart for that now that I need to finish is Les Payne's biography of Malcolm X, which won the National Book Award 2 years ago. And that the reason I say counterpart is because the autobiography of Malcolm X is really written almost as a sermon.
Mm,
Les Payne looks at a lot of the forces around Malcolm X, both in the government, but also Nation of Islam and so forth in his leadership. Um, Gosh, I'm trying to give you a third. I mean, I'm going to say, you mentioned Zora Neale Hurston. I'm going to say Zora Neale Hurston's Barracoon, which I don't know if you're familiar with
mm.
this. but
Hmm.
she interviewed the last like the known survivor of a slave ship. She interviewed him in the 1920s. This book for me resonates on multiple levels. One, it didn't get published till 2018. So just think of what it took for us to recognize this living history that Zora Neale Hurston in the 1920s recognized was important and should be chronicled. And then all the coincidences or not coincidences of advocacy on Zora Neale Hurston's behalf to get that book published.
Mm.
I'm just really glad that it endures because it could have easily. I mean, it makes you think of how many things would get burnt and not. If somebody didn't persevere or something wasn't saved, what record of history have we lost? So that's
Yeah,
the other one. How about you? What are your tops?
I would plus, can I plus one on all of yours?
Ah,
I would say anything by Toni Morrison. She is really, a masterful artist in the literary tradition. Um, Caste, I would say,
mm,
since we read and talked about Caste in our last podcast as we discussed Origin, the movie. Um, and I'm reading All About Love by Bell Hooks right now. And so can I read a quote
yeah, of
since
course.
Valentine's Day is this week, and so I'm a big meditator, and yesterday we had our people of color meditation group, and so I had asked everyone to bring like a quote from an ancestor. And so this is the one that I read from Bell Hooks. This is from All About Love. And so one of the best guides to how to be self-loving is to give ourselves the love we are often dreaming about receiving from others. There was a time when I felt lousy about my over 40 body, saw myself as too fat, too this, or too that. Yet I fantasized about finding a lover who would give me the gift of being loved as I am. It is silly, isn't it, that I would dream of someone else offering to me the acceptance and affirmation I was withholding from myself. This was a moment when the maxim, "you can never love anybody if you are unable to love yourself," made clear sense. And I add, do not expect to receive the love from someone else you do not give yourself.
Mm.
So maybe we close there. And it's always great, Mitra, to be in conversation with you. Happy Valentine's Day. Happy Black History Month. And yeah, we'll keep talking.